So welcome all, and thank you for joining us for monitoring and evaluation for climate security. This session is part of the Berlin Climate Security Conference organized by Delphi and Germany's Federal Foreign Office. Just to kick things off, we will be starting with a short video from the conference organizers. So I'll be sharing that now. All right. Amanda, if you could go ahead and share the slides. All right. So yeah, thank you all again for joining us. So this session, as I said, is monitoring and evaluation for climate security. Could you hit the next slide, Amanda? And so just to walk you through how the session is going to flow for today, we'll just be starting with a quick introduction and framing presentation, then moving on to exploring M&E for climate security, and then we'll actually be splitting into two breakout sessions for some small group discussion. The first will focus on design and monitoring. We'll reconvene to report back our findings and then break out again to discuss evaluation and learning, and finishing up with some concluding remarks from Lucas Rudinger and Carl Bruck. Next slide, please. So just to introduce myself first, my name is Shehla Chowdhury. I'm a research associate at the Environmental Law Institute, and I will be your moderator for today. We'll also be having a presentation from Dr. Amanda Woomer, who is the Monitoring and Evaluation Interest Group Chair at the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. We're also joined by Carl Bruck, who is the Director of International Programs at the Environmental Law Institute, and Lucas Rudinger, who is a Senior Advisor at Delphi. So with that, I will just go ahead and pass things over to Amanda to get us started.
Great, thanks, Shehla. So first, I will give us a little bit of framing about the project that we're working on before we talk specifically about monitoring and evaluation for environmental peace building. Our project was based on a number of questions that we had about doing monitoring and evaluation in the environmental peace building space. You know, what metrics can we use to capture both environmental and peace building impacts? How should evaluation account for long time horizons? How can we think about our outcomes and how our projects contribute to them? And in order to help practitioners who have to grapple with these questions, we came together the Environmental Law Institute, the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, and the UN Environment Program with support from the US Institutes of Peace. We're undertaking this project to improve M&E of environmental peace building. So the idea is to take stock of the existing literature and good practices, and then to create these three different outputs that you see here. The review article that'll go through what we think the field is talking about now about doing monitoring and evaluation for environmental peace building, the creation of a practitioner's toolkit, so an actual output that people can use to do M&E in environmental peace building and similar work, and then a policy brief aimed at decision makers and influencing people who can help support doing better M&E of environmental peace building. And so the project is guided also by an advisory group of global scholars and practitioners from a diverse range of disciplines, so that throughout the process, and in creating these three outputs, we are able to get diverse perspectives and get good feedback from people that would hopefully be using and reading these things. So first, to start out our discussion, we'll talk about what is monitoring and evaluation. A basic understanding of monitoring and evaluation is that it's a process through which we seek to understand and communicate the effects of our work. What's happening? What do we see? How do we understand that? Oftentimes, this entails collecting and analyzing data to understand if interventions or projects are on track, which we call monitoring, and if they achieve their objectives, which we would call evaluation. So it's both of those component pieces. Why do we do monitoring and evaluation? Oftentimes we think of it within these two buckets of accountability and learning. And accountability is about being accountable to all kinds of different stakeholders, whether those are our funders, other people that do similar work in the field with us, or the communities that we might be affecting or interacting with in the process of doing our work. So part of it is about communicating the progress and outcomes to them and having a dialogue about what's happening, what we've seen. We also just want to make sure that we are achieving our objectives as planned. That's what we promise people, whether that's funders, communities, or others. And so monitoring and evaluation helps us understand if we're achieving those objectives that we planned. But even more than that, it helps us avoid unintended and negative consequences. So it's not just about looking at, I want to do this one thing, did I do this one thing? But monitoring and evaluation helps us see if we've perhaps caused unintended and other consequences for communities, for the environment, for a lot of different spaces than we had intended to. And then the second part is learning, which is about communicating, understanding and then communicating the benefits and disadvantages of a project, its methodology, and whether we're talking about that within our project staff, within our larger organization, and again, with communities and other practitioners. You know, we want to understand, did the way that we did this make sense? Did it work the way we wanted it to? Were there unintended consequences? How did this play out? And then be able to talk about that with our coworkers, our colleagues, the community, our funders, and have some learning come out of that we can then use to change our current project or do something different in the future. So that's also adding to the larger evidence base for our theory of change explicitly, but also within that field of work, whether that's environmental peace building or climate security. And we'll talk a little bit about how the evidence base for those things is pretty limited currently. So now I want to move on to thinking about exploring monitoring and evaluation specifically for environmental security in that space. And there are a couple of reasons why M&E for climate security is different than perhaps other kinds of development projects or humanitarian projects. The first reason being that we can't just look at climate and security, but we also need to be looking at the interactions and connections between them. Where is the overlap? How are they influencing one another? If I do something in this space, how does it impact this other space? That complexity and systems, how they interact, is something that's unique to something like climate security. Another different aspect is that the context is dynamic and it's quickly changing. You know, conflict spaces, environmental spaces can often quickly change, and we need to be able to adapt that to respond. However, we also know that there are often long-term outcomes. What we do now and what we hope to achieve may not happen for many, many years, especially in the climate space. So we have to balance those quick changing contexts with the long-term outcomes when we do monitoring and evaluation. We also really need to pay attention to how doing monitoring and evaluation can affect the context. And this means being conflict sensitive is key. So even in the process of designing a project, collecting data for that project, analyzing that data, and then feeding it back, that can impact the context in which we work. And so we need to be aware of how that might happen and be able to respond to it and address it. And then the fourth thing is understanding the contribution of a particular project is difficult. There are a lot of things happening in climate security intervention context. So it's not just us acting, the climate is changing because of a lot of different factors that we may not be aware of or external to us. And so when we're thinking about evaluating and understanding our contribution to a particular outcome or impact, that's particularly difficult in the climate security context. So for our project, we seek to address some of these challenges and help practitioners in designing the toolkit, the monitoring and evaluation toolkit. And the toolkit is broken down into four component parts, really following the M&E cycle and the project cycle. And those are design, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. In the design piece of the toolkit, we look at doing needs assessment. How do we better understand the context in which we're working, including stakeholders, different dynamics. And as you all know, in climate security work, we have to look at everything. We can't just look at the environment or climate. We can't just look at policy and peace. We have to look at the whole environment. So as we're doing that in designing our projects, how do we do that with a good needs assessment to understand the context? Design also includes building theories of change or some kind of strategy. There's a lot of different words used, but we need to come up with some plan to get to where we're going over the long term. So how do we do that well in a space that's complex, that's constantly changing, that may require some different approaches to theories of change than we're used to. And then as we're designing, getting in and building in that M&E methodology from the start. How will we do monitoring? How will we do evaluation in our project, and designing that into the project from the start? With monitoring, we think about things like developing indicators, both qualitative and quantitative, measuring those indicators and analyzing the data that we have, but also tracking unintended consequences. So as we think of the unique space of climate security, what are potential for unintended consequences and how will we know? So we build that into the monitoring piece of the M&E framework. We also think a lot about participatory processes and how we can do that in the monitoring that we do. How do we bring other stakeholders in who might benefit from learning about the project, from contributing to the development of indicators, to participating in looking at the data that we collect? How do we do that in a way that doesn't exacerbate conflict, that can contribute to positive impacts on our project? And then also ensuring the use of monitoring data. And that applies to evaluation and learning as well. But if we're going to collect the data, we want to make sure it gets used. So how do we do that? In the evaluation component of our toolkit, we address things like project evaluation, but also programmatic evaluation or collection of projects. And that's particularly important when we think, again, about the complexity of climate security interventions and those long time horizons. And then we're also talking about emergent evaluation approaches, such as real-time evaluations or developmental evaluations and others that may be more useful in contexts that are really changing frequently and that can pose particular challenges for making sure that we get the information we need and we get to use it quickly. And then the final piece of our toolkit is focused on learning. So again, how do we use monitoring and evaluation effectively and ensure that we're taking the lessons learned and we're incorporating them into our work? We also think about learning at different scales. You know, it's one thing to learn within your project team, But what about learning within your entire institution or organization? What about sharing learnings more broadly? And how do we do that? Especially if our learnings are not particularly very positive. And generally, just contributing to the building the evidence base for what climate security interventions look like. What does success look like? What's working? What's not working? And then the last piece I have here is accountability. And there's a star because actually accountability occurs throughout, where we want to be thinking about who are we accountable? How do we bring them in? How do we make sure that we're delivering what we said we would, that we're giving people a voice, that there's responsiveness and transparency to these different stakeholder groups. So that really plays out in each of these sections. As we've been designing the toolkit and working through this project generally, we think about a number of really important key challenges that affect how we're able to do monitoring and evaluation, and how we can use something like the toolkit to address those key challenges and give practitioners and others some guidance on what they can do in these spaces. The first one is that practitioners can struggle to create metrics and indicators that capture the environmental, the social, the political dimensions of their work and how they're connected. That's been a struggle for a lot of projects that may be heavily focused on the climate side or the peace building side or the environmental side, and haven't really been able to capture metrics or indicators that encompass all of those spaces and that allow you to see how those spaces are then interacting with each other. So a real systems focus. I mentioned before, but impacts often occur over a long time horizon. We don't know what will happen with the climate in 6 months. We really have to wait years. So how do we measure that? How do we evaluate that? The same thing with peace building and security issues. Oftentimes, we may not know if security or peace is sustainable until we've been able to look over a longer time horizon. Again, those real world dynamics of things constantly changing, of external factors influencing our context in which we're working, those make defining causal relationships between our intervention and the outcomes difficult. Oftentimes you don't hear people at all talking about attribution anymore because it's just so difficult. We often talk about contribution. There aren't these control cases that we can look to understand the impacts of our work. So how do we know? Since we are also operating in fragile and conflict-affected contexts, this means that there's difficulties in doing our work, but also in doing the M&E for our work. Maybe we can't collect data because we can't get to a space. A lot of us have experienced that just during the COVID-19 pandemic. Places where we may have gone to do an evaluation before, we can no longer get to. So what do we do if there are disruptions in our data collection and our analysis? How can we disseminate results or have discussions about them if we can't meet people in person? How do we ensure that our learning can happen quickly and be incorporated quickly in these very volatile contexts? These are all really important challenges for the work that we do and for doing good monitoring and evaluation. And again, it's essential to do conflict-sensitive monitoring and evaluation throughout the project cycle, from design, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. We have to think about how we're doing things and who's included can affect what the outcome is. You know, including one group and not another may exacerbate conflicts. Sharing some information or holding back some information could also play a role in how people respond to the work that we're doing. So it's really important to be conflict sensitive. Mentioned participation before. We know participation is essential. We know it contributes to buy-in. We know it contributes to sustainability. We know that we're going to have a better understanding of the problems and their solutions with more participation. But again, who participates and how is potentially fraught. And then going back to, there's a dearth of existing guidance for M&E on these kinds of interventions. There's a ton of information and guidance out there on doing M&E, but they often don't include addressing these key challenges. So that's something that we are hoping to address with our toolkit and with our larger project. So just a minute to look at how we might address a couple of these challenges. And these are things we're thinking about as we're designing this toolkit. Thinking about long time horizons, how can we address those? Well, the biggest thing we can do is plan ahead. From the start, when we're doing our needs assessment and doing our design, we need to think through how monitoring, evaluation, and learning strategy, how we resource that. Are we saving ample budget for it? Are we including the right people in it? Are we making sure we have enough time after our project to do some evaluation and that we've saved, money and resources for that? We may also decide to address long time horizons that we will consider programmatic evaluation, so looking at a collection of projects. If we're thinking about the issues of participation, we know we want to be as participatory as possible, but we need to make sure we really understand the context. So that means including a range of stakeholders in determining our M&E approach, collecting and analyzing our data, and conducting evaluations. So instead of me going somewhere and making all the decisions about what we're going to do for M&E, I can bring people in who really understand the context, who really understand what's possible, that these indicators may be really difficult to capture, or this methodology for getting data won't work. If I bring in other people, I can understand better the context and what we really need to make M&E work. And again, participation increases buy-in and will also lead to more valid learning. As we all know, if we just ask one person what they think, we're going to get a very different picture than if we ask a lot of different people who come from different spaces, different backgrounds, and have different perspectives. So make sure the who and the how is well thought out as you're doing your M&E work to avoid any unintended consequences. And then finally, if we think about volatile operating context, we want to monitor the context, not just the defined indicators. Sometimes it's really easy to, if we're doing a theory of change, list out our indicators and really focus in on tracking those. And we might miss things that are happening in the context. And so we need maybe indicators for that, both qualitative and quantitative, to see how dynamics between communities might be shifting, if there are changes in policies that might affect our project. We have to look at the bigger picture while still making sure we gather the information for our indicators. We also have to be flexible and have backup options for monitoring. This might mean setting aside some flexibility in our budget, but also might be having backup technology options when we can't get to a place. I mentioned the COVID-19 example before. If we find that we're not able to go to a community and collect data, maybe we rely on technology like SMS surveys. Another thing is focusing on the need to know as opposed to the nice to know. A lot of times we get really excited about getting the data and getting the evidence, and we have too many things that we need to collect. We make it too complex for ourselves. And this is particularly problematic when we're in these volatile operating contexts. Instead, we need to narrow down on what we really need to know if this is working, and focus on getting good data for that. And then finally, considering real-time evaluations or alternative M&E approaches that may be less traditional, but maybe more appropriate for our context. So I will stop there, and then we have our breakout rooms. And I will share our questions for those rooms.
Yeah, so I will be breaking out everyone into breakout rooms. There might be a little bit of shuffling around as you enter your rooms initially. But yeah, Amanda, please go ahead.
So our first breakout session is on design and monitoring. And then as a reminder, the next one will be on evaluation and learning. And so we have these 4 high-level questions that we are thinking about and can discuss in our breakout rooms. The first is, what tools or processes are we using to design theories of change or strategies for climate security interventions? What do climate security indicators look like specific to this space? Similarly, what information do we need to monitor those? So if we're thinking about indicators, what information do we need, both qualitative and quantitative, to monitor these interventions effectively? And then what are their challenges in getting the data? You know, we talked a little bit about using technology to overcome some of the problems with traveling with COVID-19. What are our other challenges to getting the data, and how can we address those?
All right, so we'll have 20 minutes for this first breakout room, and I'll be sending you all there shortly. All right, I believe we have everyone back from the breakout rooms. So we will just go ahead and go group by group to report back. Amanda, do you want to start out?
Sure. I didn't realize it muted me when I came back. We had a far-ranging conversation. I think one of the really important things we talked about a little bit at the beginning was engaging these different kinds of groups that may otherwise be marginalized, like young people, especially since they have such a role to play in the future, and local communities who have the knowledge and the information and possibly the solutions, but also understanding and engaging them. That's an investment by those people. You know, it's their time, it's their knowledge, and making sure that we're respectful and accountable in what we do with that and how much we ask for it. We also talked a little bit about indicators and how we can get good indicators that are more predictive or forward future looking versus some that might tell us what things have already happened. For example, in migration, you know, we may see when people migrate, but by the time they've decided to migrate, you know, things have gotten to a point where people have to make that very difficult decision. And then we also talked about qualitative indicators and the importance of getting subjective perceptions and combining those with more quantitative indicators. And then we ended on a really interesting conversation about EGAD's integrated early warning system in East Africa, and the different indicators that they're looking at, including now like conflict and health.
Thank you, Amanda. Carl, would you like to share next?
Yes, thank you. So we had a wide-ranging discussion also looking at international climate change projects in Afghanistan, local climate change work in Mexican communities, and the use of Earth observation data for climate security, among others. A couple things that stood out. A lot of the indicators that were discussed that people are currently using tend to be, first, very granular, and secondly, they tend to be very environmental. And there's not a lot, at least of the examples that we were discussing, there's not a lot that's actually looking at the intersection of climate and security. So how does the intervention to increase climate resilience in this way lead to an increase in security? Or how does it, how does security degradation affect the degradation of the security situation affect the efforts to improve climate resilience? So there's a theory of change, but the indicators tend to be very specific, often on the environmental side.
All right, thank you, Carl. And Lucas, would you like to share out for your group?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, also very interesting discussion going from Mali to Colombia, and maybe just a couple of highlights from there. So I think interesting example was shared of kind of how to use existing reporting systems from, for example, peacekeeping missions, how you can maybe expand the existing human rights reporting systems to also include indicators on climate security, be that around natural resource management, around water, around scarcity. We also discussed quite a bit around like what challenges remain around climate security indicators and how to get the right data. I think one thing that came out quite clearly is the importance of creating an environment in which, if you collect qualitative data, in which communities or members feel comfortable in sharing results around more sensitive topics, especially if we're talking about conflict and security. So that is often quite challenging and needs a lot of work. We also discussed a bit about climate security indicators, had a discussion, are there even climate security indicators, or is it always a climate or a security indicator, and then you have to somehow relate them? I think there were some examples where it's maybe both, around, especially around natural resource management. There might be some indicators that really cover both. Other topics are maybe a bit harder, where it's a bit harder. And then also kind of lastly, we touched upon the other larger question is like kind of how, once you have that data and those indicators, how can you turn that into appropriate action, so that that knowledge doesn't always mean that you then appropriately react to the information. Okay. But that was like very quickly, over to you.
All right. And yeah, likewise with all of the other groups, our group definitely had a very wide-ranging discussion, touched on a lot of different aspects. But I would say one of the through lines that we touched upon is just that while it is clear that climate change is an exacerbation of resource scarcity and a lot of resource conflict, the pathways of disruption are not always immediately clear. And so really understanding and focusing in on the community or the project focus, figuring out and assessing what climate impacts look in that community, what things that they can actually change in that community, and really trying to imagine, the project within the larger system and take a complex systems approach to try to figure out the pathways that make sense for your theory of change. We also talked a lot about indicators, and in particular, the need to kind of balance dynamic indicators with more static indicators. So the kinds of things that you can pull from big databases that are kind of updated annually and tend to be more granular or more environmentally focused, and balancing those things out with the realities that communities might be facing. So focusing in on, not just how much money or community is able to make, but also, what can they buy with that money, what areas of focus. And so figuring out these systems approaches, figuring out a balance of indicators that make sense for your particular project and context, and figuring out, exactly what pathways are at work with your work is, I think, really key in the design phase. And also very quickly, we did briefly touch upon just the fact that these are all very long-term projects and trying to design and focus around that concept of long-term impact. So with that, I am going to send us back into breakout groups, and we will enter into our next discussion. Amanda, I'm not sure if you want to show the questions again before we jump in.
I put them in the chat this time ahead of time, so everyone should have access to the 4 questions to look at in their group.
All right. I will send us all out then. And once again, we'll be in there for 20 minutes. All right, I think we have everyone back from the breakout rooms. So we will kind of speed through this second report back so we can get to our closing comments. But Amanda, if you'd like to start us out again, please feel free to.
Sure. I'll just mention 2 things really quickly. We talked a lot about connecting different levels of data and evaluation, where we're thinking about communities oftentimes, but then also at a more regional, state, national, global level, and how to really connect those things or have the data at those different levels. And then the second thing I thought was really interesting is at the end, we were talking about attribution and contribution. And there was a mention of a report where the evaluator wanted to assign attribution and the project team said no, because they didn't feel like it could be, but then they talked about coherence. So was there really good coherence of the organizations working in that space at that time? And that's what it was. And it came up again, if whether or not we're thinking about coherence in approaches and spaces and units of analysis as we're doing this. It was a really interesting conversation. I wish we had more time.
Thank you, Miranda. Carl, would you like to go next?
Sure. A few quick observations. One, the final evaluation on one of the projects was we never got there. The project never got there because it was in Afghanistan. There's been a change of regime, and the project has been ceased. So I think that that's one of the risks of working on climate security in a fragile and conflict-affected situation. I think a number of people talked about a very granular approach to evaluation, and often relying very much on kind of household level risks and opportunities, and whether it's reductions in numbers of days of flooding or height of flood, or improvements in livelihoods, but it tends to be very granular. There also, it tends to, the security side tends to be more in the theory of change. So, you know, if we do this, that will improve security, and then look for impacts that what the intervention did, it did reduce flooding, but then the question of how did that relate to security, it's never actually tied in. And some of that might be the question of difficulty in kind of showing the causal link in reduction in insecurity. The other is, I think, also different conceptualizations, whether it's a kind of a violent security sort of issue, or it's more of a human security. So I think that there may be some conceptual differences there. And then the other thing was highlighting that evaluation is not only at the end, but also there are midterm evaluations, intermediate evaluations in these. So I think it's important not to focus only on the end evaluation.
All right, thank you, Carl. I'll actually report back from my group, and then Lucas, I'll throw it to you for both your report back and for your concluding remarks. So likewise, we had quite a ranging discussion on our side as well. To your point, Carl, we also discussed a little bit about kind of this conflation of conflict security or climate security, as well as disaster risk reduction, and how the two things are different and are becoming more in vogue to perhaps take a disaster risk reduction intervention and kind of frame it as a climate security intervention. And from that, we got into a little bit of discussion about the different backgrounds that people are coming from in these kinds of interventions. So you have people approaching it often from, you know, the more environmental perspective, or from the more social governance perspective. And so figuring out how to best capture the synergies between these different pieces, particularly when for a lot of people, even though climate security is itself nearly 20 years old or more, it's still a very novel area of work, and it's growing, you know, more in fashion now. There's still quite a lack of guidance in how to integrate these different parts of it. And so we really dug into that in terms of differentiating just conflict security, conflict sensitivity work from actual positive peace building, and also how to capture those peace building elements within the evaluations, and showing the synergies between that and the more environmental aspects, which is still something that is, as we all know, a challenge, but something we should focus more on as a field. So with that, I will throw it over to you, Lucas, for your report back and your remarks.
Great, thank you. Yeah, maybe quickly from my group, also very interesting discussion, and we started with the attribution question, where I think we ended up where we always end up there. It's very hard, but we should try. Then moved on a bit, got very deep into the discussion around kind of military and security actors and the importance to really speak their language when developing these systems and how to integrate it into their planning processes. And then maybe also the challenges that remain to make them hear results or messages that they don't want to hear, and how to do that, and maybe using kind of units within the military or certain actors that can deliver that message better than other people. And then ended kind of on the importance, kind of the learning from each other, kind of from the development humanitarian side over to the environment and the security and military, and how many opportunities that had. And yeah, with that, I would segue into my concluding remarks. I mean, I think the discussion in the working groups and what I heard from the other working groups was really exciting and interesting. I mean, I can just reflect that we are all kind of in the same spot in the beginning, and it's super important that we have these spaces to kind of start talking about this and really exchange practices. And also what we can see is like how much there's happening in this space from different actors that are now doing it on the ground. I think a couple of years back, we were still talking about maybe having the first projects and we're raising awareness a lot. And now there is so much more action on the ground that M&E has become much more of an issue. And maybe I'd like to end with some of my personal experiences and one project that I've been working on for the past 4 years that is together with UNEP. It's called the Climate Change and Security Project, and we piloted activities in Nepal and Sudan that link climate change adaptation and peace building. And our role at Adelphi was also supporting the specifically with amongst other things, the M&E. And in fact, I just came back on Monday from our final evaluation mission in Sudan. And I think some of the lessons learned from that mission, but also the project larger, kind of reflect a lot of the discussion of today. And one thing is, like, for example, we developed the guidance materials within the project, but really also saw the limits of providing guidance and how much time and effort it takes in terms of capacity building and creating awareness within our implementing partners to take that up and to really put it into action, so that how guidance has to be embedded into a larger process and bring people together around there, and how many years it took us for people to really understand what we're trying to do. And then, of course, the importance of combining quantitative and qualitative approaches, kind of surveys, but especially also focus group discussion, key informant interviews, and really trying to talk to as many people as possible to kind of verify the quantitative data, to make sense of it. And then also when talking to individuals, really creating an environment in which they feel comfortable sharing results. And that also took time, kind of just building the trust with communities, going there again and again, for them to feel free to share, especially on sensitive topics. And then kind of the attribution question, of course, we also tried to address that within our project. And I think as I said before, trying our best and being very transparent about our limitations and the context and how that changed throughout the project is important. And then maybe lastly, something that we are using quite a bit in this project is kind of using stories and examples and case studies to kind of really illustrate results and contextualize them. I think for learning, for lessons learned, it's really important to provide these very practical examples and case studies for others to learn from. So it's not just enough to do kind of an M&E report with some survey results, but you really need to contextualize them to allow for learning and to make it a tool for learning. And with that, I would like to finish and hand over back to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Lucas. And to take us home today, Carl, if you'd like to wrap us up.
Thank you. I think Lucas did a fantastic job in tying together the loose ends. I would only say that this is an ongoing process. We have actually 365 days left in which we will be working on this. At least the work that Amanda laid out at the beginning, the toolkit, the review article, and the policy brief, but this is an ongoing effort. And I would encourage people who are interested in continuing to engage on these issues to share their experiences, or if you're willing to be interviewed, please contact either Amanda, Shehla, or myself. We would be very interested in talking with you and learning from your experiences. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your active engagement, and particularly thank Amanda, Shehla, and Lucas for making this such a rich event. Have a good day.
Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
all.